Okay, so we are going to go back. I didn't know if might have some visitors this morning, so I got prepared to do a little bit of a recap from last week and catch us up to where we left off last week. So it would help if you could see what. We're going to have some talking points here. So we talked last week about the Acts chapter 13, where these churches in Galatia were originally preached to, and they were originally established. So Paul preached the history of the Jews to this area, and then in chapter 13, verse 39, he stated that through Christ, everyone who believed could have forgiveness of sins, and this was going to include the Gentiles, as well, because Christ died for all. And then verse 45, the Jews were, jealous of the inclusion of the Gentiles. Paul and Barnabas stated, "We are turning to the Gentiles. The Jews had renounced the gospel; they rejected it, so they were turning to the Gentiles." And then in verse 50 of chapter 13, Jews incited prominent men and women in that area, against Paul and Barnabas, drove them out of their area in their district, and they continued preaching, but it was pretty kind of volatile in that area, where they were preaching, because a lot of the Jews, in this area, you had Jews who hadn't accepted the gospel, right? You had Jews who had accepted the gospel. You had Jews who had accepted the gospel that still wanted to hang on to some of the Old Testament. You had Gentiles that were being converted. Then you had Gentiles who didn't believe. So you had a lot of different beliefs, going on in that same time.
Good question, but once a Jew accepted the Christian faith, were they still a Jew?
Well, culturally, yeah, they're still a Jew.
I mean, it's not a nationality. I mean, it's not like Italian.
Right.
So would they still be Jewish?
Well, I mean, they're Christians, but they're right. They're Jews in that, culturally they were still Jews, right?
Okay.
So they're Christians, right? So they're Judaizing Christians, right? So I guess your point is, what I stated was, you had Jews who had accepted the gospel, right? So those are Christians.
I guess I look at it as Judaism being a faith and Christianity being a faith. And so you can't be both faiths. I think that's what's throwing me off.
Well, I think that's the way it is today. But I think back then it was more of a lineage type thing, because
Right, I'm a descendant of Abraham.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think now it's become it's a religion. So Judaism is a religion. You could probably still have people that are Jews by lineage, but back then they were Jews by lineage, and they had their faith, right? But now it's become Judaism.
Right.
Then it kind of go from being Jewish to being Hebrew.
Yeah, because it's just like they said, Jews and Gentiles. So those are the types of. Gentile wasn't a religion. It was just a type of people.
Right. They were all non-Jews. All the Gentiles were non-Jews. Right. But good point. So I want to make sure that words mean things. I want to make sure I don't get anybody on the wrong track here. So, and then in chapter 14. So in Iconium, so they're Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, those are kind of the areas we talked about last week. Paul and Barnabas preached, and many of the Jews and Gentiles both believed, but unbelieving Jews caused Gentiles to be embittered against the brethren. So unbelieving Jews, still causing problems, and that's what we're going to see here. Some of the Judaizing teachers, Judaizing teachers are the ones that were Christians, but they still held to the old law. So then Paul and Barnabas fled stoning and abuse in Iconium, and then they fled to Lystra. And then while Paul was in Lystra, he was stoned. Some of the Jews from Antioch and Iconium, where he left, they came there, basically sought him out, and they stoned him there. So it was a pretty volatile area there. And this is a point that we talked about, I think, a little bit maybe last week, but I think it bears mentioning going into the book of Galatians, is that these congregations were set up with elders. So at least at the time, at this initial time, they had elders. Now, where they are in Galatians now, when we look at Galatians, whether these congregations still have elders? We assume that they would, right? Because Paul says, I'm amazed how quickly you're starting to desert what you believe. So you would think, they had elders there. There's still elders at some of these congregations in Galatia. And then in Galatians, kind of what we recap of what we talked about last week, is Paul, an apostle, was sent by Christ and God the Father. So God raised Jesus from the dead. He said he was not sent by men, and that's what we're going to talk about a lot today. So he didn't have any agenda. He was trying to preach from other people. Right? So Paul was on the road to Damascus to do what when he was converted?
Crucified a Christian.
Right. He's going this way, and he ends up going 180 degrees the other direction. So, his preaching was a revelation from God. He was inspired. All the apostles were inspired, but he didn't have any particular agenda. He was trying to preach just the gospel. So, to all the churches in the Galatia region, this book is written to all those congregations. So they must have had some similar things going on there. The Judaizing teachers were trying to get them to hold to circumcision, some of the things from the old law. And that we talked about needing to be rescued from the present evil. So one present evil obviously was the Judaizing teachers, and then another present evil might just be the general evil that's going on there at the time, just like we have all kinds of evil and sin also surrounding us. And then Jesus gave himself for us according to God's will, and God is the one who deserves the glory, not men. We talked about that last week, and so that kind of catches us up to probably a good place to start. We talked about some of this in verse 6, but we're going to go ahead and start and read 6 through 10, talk about that some, and then probably pick up most of our class today after verse 10. So let's go ahead and read verses 6 through 10. Keith, let's start with you, and Carrie, come this way, and whoever finishes with 10, so take 2 or 3 verses and we'll finish that up. 6 through 10 of Galatians chapter 1.
I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ.
But even if we, who are an angel of heaven, preach any other gospel to you than we have preached to you, be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed.
For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I still please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ.
Right, so we talked about this last week, and Paul was really amazed that they had turned away so quickly from the teaching. They were turning away from the truth. So he taught them, right? And so we talked about this last week. If he taught them and you taught somebody and you thought that they knew what you had taught them, you too would be surprised that, why is it so quickly you quit believing what I thought you were grounded, right? I thought you understood. So what's that tell you about these false teachers, though? If Paul taught them and thought that they understood, right, and if they were converted, what's it tell you about these false teachers?
They didn't really take in the teaching, and they were looking to possibly, take over and say, well, that can't be all right. Like Paul taught us, we grew up in the Jewish faith.
Right. So we knew that these false teachers, for one, even back when these congregations were established, we know that there were some that didn't believe then. So some of these are already trying to stir things up from a while back. But if you know something, EJ?
It sounds like the false teachers, they had more influence of taking things out of content and making it sound so sweet, so it sounded very much better than what Paul was saying, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Right. That was the point I was trying to make. So if you understand something very well, what's it going to take for you to change your mind about something?
Someone who's very convincing. Someone who's very convincing.
Very convincing, right? So they must be pretty good at what they're doing.
And like EJ said, they had to make it sound better than what Paul was offering.
Right. And so that's what I think the point we're making here. And even so, going back to what we just talked about earlier, these these congregations had elders, right? So it tells you that even though there's elders at a congregation, doesn't mean that false teaching can't happen, false teaching can't come in. We know that can.
Well, yeah, you can throw up the point of Ephesus. Remember when Paul had all the elders of Ephesus, they left. The main point he was telling them was that from among you will rise. So you should fall off. I'm paraphrasing, but basically that was it.
Right.
He was warning them. He knew that.
Right, and having somebody come in from within your group is harder to identify, right, than somebody who comes in from the outside, right? Because they know the group, and they know, well, if I just put a little bit, let me plant this seed and see how that takes. Somebody bid on that, kind of like your bishop. Somebody bid on that, so let me go over here and kind of work this person a little bit, and then I can get that person, and then they can talk to somebody else. And so you just don't come in and say, hey, I'm preaching false teaching. Anybody want to believe this? No, you got to make it look like, it's the real thing. I think Chuck's talked a little bit about counterfeit money. You don't teach them what it doesn't look like. You teach them what, the real thing looks like, and that way anything else you immediately identify with, oh, that's not the real thing. And we talked about this last week. There's no different gospel. There's only one gospel. So these claim of the false teachers, they're saying that it's the same. What they're teaching is, oh, well, this is the truth. And what you're teaching is false. So they're trying to teach, oh, this is the truth. So that means it's up to the person to determine, right? You've got to weigh everything and determine what's right and what's not. Some wanted to distort the gospel. They want to confuse other people, as if Paul left something out. So Paul didn't leave anything out of his teaching. So you don't see Paul here questioning, well, I wonder if did I forget to mention something? He knew that what he was teaching was a revelation from God. He's just got to convince them, and teach them that, what he's teaching. So he's got these false accusers. So you've got two sides to the story here. And then Paul says, if an angel or anybody else brings another teaching, don't believe it. So, any other apostle, if an apostle showed up and, any of the other apostles and said, here, this is what's true, Paul was wrong, right? Paul wasn't in Jerusalem where all the other apostles were, right? Paul was on his way to Damascus to persecute the church when he was converted. Then he went off teaching. We're going to see that. He mentions that here in some of the future verses, is that he wasn't with the other apostles. So Paul here is by himself, right? So his revelation. So they're thinking, well, you're an apostle, but you're not one of the apostles, right? You're kind of a new apostle, right? So maybe what you're teaching isn't as true as what we would hear from somebody who's from Jerusalem.
Yeah, he didn't just state it once, he stated it twice about that if anybody teaches something different. He didn't just put it down in one paragraph, he put it down twice. So I know that it can't be something different, otherwise you would be cursed for teaching something false.
Right. Yet they were still believing that, but he's telling them, Mike?
It's interesting, even Paul, an apostle, tells them that, the standard is the gospel. That the given standard is not the person, giving it to you. Because a lot of people, in denominations or maybe in the church, tend to focus so much on, the preacher or the person giving the message, as opposed to, what the actual truth is. And even Paul, the apostle, says, listen, even if we stand up here and get something different, you don't pay attention to that. Your standard isn't worth.
Right, and then we talk about that having a standard, right? And the standard of what you're teaching has to fit within that standard. So is Paul trying to please men here, or is he trying to please God? Right? He's trying to please God. He's not trying to please the men, because they're telling him, well, Paul, this is what these false teachers are believing. So, he had been in this area before. He knew what it was like there, right? He knew the pressure that these people, he'd been stoned before for teaching the truth, right? So if you feel a lot of pressure about something that you're presenting, what's something that you want to do?
make it to where everybody likes what you're saying.
Right, let me change the message a little bit, right? Because if I'm too staunch here, if I'm too hard, right, then, I could get stoned again, right? Something bad could happen to me. So I'm sure there are people in the world today who might shirk back, say, I'm not going to do that or I'm not going to preach too much. Let me just kind of water things down a little bit. Let me just talk about love, but not get into any real meat issues because there might be some controversy and I don't want to deal with that. Dave?
It's called compromise, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, it's called compromise, and that's not a good thing, right? So, watering down the gospel, only preaching, what you're preaching is the truth. You're never preaching all the truth, right? You're only preaching, a part of it. As we mentioned before, is that these congregations, had elders, and so we don't know to what extent, the elders, were involved in what was going on here. But we know that, that even though there are elders there, it didn't stop these false teachers from coming in to try to promote their cause, right?
Could some of the elders even be false teachers?
That's possible, right? We don't know. We don't know if some of these congregations maybe didn't have elders anymore at this time, and that's why the false teachers came in. But we do know that originally these congregations had elders, and so how quickly they turned away, it either shows the eldership wasn't strong enough, or the eldership was combating this. So it's conceivable that some groups still come in and they still teach that, even though there's elders there, they're going to still teach because the people who are weak could fall away and follow these people and not stay at the other, with the congregation and with what the gospel is teaching.
I'm not making excuses for them turning away, but how old was the congregation? Their elders couldn't have the knowledge that, say, elders today would possess, having the word written down, being able to say. We don't pick someone to be an elder that's been a Christian for 2 years just because they meet the qualifications of having believing children, yada, yada, yada. And so how much, good knowledge did these elders have?
Well, the qualifications for elders today doesn't change, from what it was then. So we have to think that.
But they had to start out.
Relatively
with not a whole lot of knowledge. So to me, it just seems like it would have been easy for them to fall away because they didn't have the written word yet, and they were a fairly new congregation.
Right, and to your point, it's easier for us to go to the written word and see somebody says 2 + 2 is 5, and I see here it says 2 + 2 is 4,
right.
Whereas the spoken word, right, and then the letters that have been written and passed around from congregation to congregation, and then they just had to assemble all that information as a congregation and then to preach the gospel. So the gospel is Jesus Christ and Him crucified and trying to convert those people. But right, they didn't have the written word like here, so we think it would be easier, and evidently it's how easier it is. But it's probably not any easier today for somebody to come in and teach false doctrine than it was then. Anybody can come in here and just sit and listen and be quiet, right? And then they can start working, behind the scenes, and that's the way false teaching happens. Dave?
Well, back then, they were in certain areas for not very long. So elders back then were chosen in a much shorter period of time than today, right?
Possibly, but they still had to have the same qualifications. They may have been, converted, a couple of years, 5 years, 10 years. I don't know how long this had been since, it was a short time, but short's kind of a relative term. Is it 2 years, 3 years? Probably wasn't 6 months. Gene?
I think the area that Galatian area was probably covered by his second journey, which wasn't long after his first journey. Back to the first journey, they just turned around and went back. So, Jesus was AD 33 was probably where he was crucified and whatnot. And Paul he was converted there, during that period. And according to the, what they say, his book, Bishop and Figure, Galatians was the first one that was written to, about 50, 51, 52, 53, 54. Say 15 years, 12 to 15 years after probably Paul's journey.
Right.
So also what they could do, the apostles and whatnot, they could give them the gift of knowledge. And Moses, Paul was traveling, see, they had gifts that they could give them. To us today, that it's hard for us to realize that.
Yeah.
But so I would say that's how, I thought a lot about that because it's being an elder, like you said. But I'd say they got gifts.
Right. And the point I was just wanting to make with all this was that, these congregations had leadership, and yet false teaching still came in. And I think that's kind of where I wanted to go with that. So let's look at any other questions that we want to talk about here through verse 10, and we'll jump into 11 through 21 here. So TJ, if you'll start reading 2 verses 11 through 21. So come on up this way, and then we'll start with Warren and go backward till we finish 21.
But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ.
For you have heard of my former manner of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestry traditions.
But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, is it really the Son in me that I might preach him among the Gentiles? I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood.
Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went through Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter, and remained with him 15 days.
But other of the apostles saw I none, except James, the Lord's brother. Now the things which I write unto you, behold, before God I lie not.
Afterwards I came into the regions of Syria and Cilicia.
All right, so here Paul's having to defend his apostleship and to tell them that the preaching that he's doing didn't come from man. It came from the revelation that he received of Christ. And so we talked about that. So that was when he was on the road to Damascus, right? And he was going to persecute more Christians, right? So Paul said he was the chiefest of sinners, right? And so what he meant by that was when he was himself felt like he was the staunchest, the most dynamic persecutor of Christians, and and he grew, in his love, I guess you could call love of doing that, right? So as a Jew, Christianity's coming in and he's wanting to stomp it out, and so he's taking, he's telling them, this is where I was, right? And my calling came from revelation of Jesus Christ. It didn't come from man, and so he's trying to tell them that what I preached to you and what I was taught came from Jesus Christ through God. It didn't come from man.
And he didn't even go ask any man about it. He didn't confer with them on it. He knew that it was revelation.
Correct. So as we talked about, he didn't, what we just read about here is he didn't, after he was converted, he didn't seek out flesh and blood and immediately go consult with, other Christians. So he went directly and started preaching. So, it said it wasn't until 3 years that he went up to Jerusalem. So he discussed his zealous role previously in helping to advance Judaism, right? So he was, so, I mean, you can see Paul here and the fervor that he had for, persecuting Christians, and then the fervor that he has now once he does the 180. So, I mean, think about your own life as, before you became a Christian. I mean, when you were, before you became a Christian, your life is, with sin in it. Did it matter to you if you did 1 sin or 10 sins? Really? TJ, you're shaking. No, it didn't matter, right?
No.
Why didn't it matter?
Sin is sin.
Right. Sin is sin, right? 1 sin, if I lie, if I steal, if I do whatever, it's like, I already know that I'm in sin. Can I get any deeper in sin? I mean, can I get any further away from God? Right?
No.
Sin separates me from God. Right?
You like to think you can.
Right.
You like to think that, well, this is not.
This isn't so bad, right? So as a sinner, right, you're thinking that I'm not that far. I'm not that far away from being religious, right? And that's what we're going to talk about today on the radio show, is about being. Can I have just a little bit of religion?
It's almost like he was doing it. He thought he was doing God's work.
Right.
It's persecuting the Christians because they were way out there and they were following the laws of the Judaism and Moses.
Right.
He thought he was doing right.
Right. And so once he decides, to obey the gospel, and he's not doing that, now he turns that same effort, the same love that he had for persecuting Christians, he's now taken that love to teaching the gospel. And so, I think it's a great example for us that, from Paul, is that, he just, once he's flipped the switch, he never looked back, and he just kept on, driving with that same inner strength that, that he had, same that we should have, ourselves. So he tried to destroy the church. Said he was the chiefest of sinners, I've mentioned in 1 Timothy chapter 1. Persecuting the church in Philippians chapter 3. Beyond measure, it said he made every attempt. So every opportunity he had to stamp out Christianity, that's what he was doing. And now he's talking to them, but when, he changed, when it was revealed to him that I might preach to the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. So, he just took that message, that he was being inspired to teach, and continued to preach that without consulting with anyone else. So if he's not consulting with anyone else, so could these false teachers say that what he's teaching is from man? No, and that's what the point he's trying to make here. What I'm teaching came from God, and what you're hearing from these false teachers came from man. So nothing else influenced his message. He talks about the flesh and blood, being other apostles, and then later down here it talks about in verse 18. 3 years later, I went to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. Why is it important to say I stayed with him only for 15 days? Does it matter how long he stayed with Peter?
Well, the way he was saying, I wouldn't get what I'm preaching from Peter.
Right.
I'm getting it from God. And I'm just thinking what Trey said. If you think back in those times, I'm sure they didn't have it as easy as we do today with the Word and all this and that. But all the apostles and those that they taught were all teaching the same thing, which means they had to get that message from God. In other words, through knowledge and what they're teaching the same thing, because that area is a big, big area of the country.
Right, and they're all inspired.
Yeah.
Right?
See, so they're teaching the same thing.
So if I only stayed with Peter 15 days, it's basically saying I wasn't with him long enough to talk about these issues to come up with some man's idea. So Peter had some other, obviously Peter had some other thoughts, that, each man had their own thoughts about, what they were being taught, could have their own ideas about what they could teach, right? But he wasn't there long enough for somebody else to influence him. Even Peter only stayed with him 15 days. So he's telling the Galatians there, trying to emphasize what I'm teaching for you only came from God. So if it only came from God, then, and I'm telling you one thing and these others are telling you something else, then what must be true and what must not be true?
And that's the reason each congregation is autonomous, because if River Ridge was a group for the, Southern or Indiana Church of Christ, or whatever you want to call it, then you'd be getting your teaching from your creed book or whatnot, and all of you are wrong, because you're being taught the wrong thing.
So, I mean, how many different false teachings would there have to be for each congregation to believe something different? I mean, there could be multiple, right? False. So if this is the standard, so if I preach to you something over here on my right, this is your left, on the right, that's wrong, and somebody else is preaching something over here on my left, which is your right, which is wrong, right? They're both wrong, right?
At least one.
Right.
Both,
So you could have some false teachers in your area teaching one thing. Warren, you could have some false teachers in your area teaching something else. It doesn't have to be the same. It's not like the false teachers all get together and say, let's all preach this one thing. Now, in this area, in Galatia, we know that they were teaching circumcision, obviously, which was a big deal to the Jews, right? Gentiles, if you're going to be like us, then you've got to be, right, you've got to be circumcised, which wasn't true. But that doesn't mean that other false teachings can't creep in. Right? It doesn't have to be just one thing. So we're looking for A. Is it easy for B to come in? Right? If you're only focusing on this kind of false teaching, is it easy for something else to come in that you're not looking for? I wasn't even looking for that, and there it is. And so you've got to be watchful all the time, Warren.
Well, I think most false teaching is very subtle. It's not what's going to be a radical change from 1 week. Change comes much. It's what's the word? It's more
insidious.
It slides in. You don't understand it. And once you go that first step, everybody's getting lessons about it. The Church of Christ and the Christian church, how that broke out and how they started. It was just a few things. It wasn't just radical. They went to having all the things they have today. It's a very gradual, subtle, what's a big deal? Got enough people who support have a piano. Then they go from the piano to the orchestra. Then they go. That's how it progresses. It becomes a few years. You look back and it's nothing to what it was before. I think that's what we really need to watch. Is that subtleness comes in. We have issues about a lot of things. I think we can have it no consequence. We talked about the Lord's Supper, when we take it, etc., etc. We've heard a lot of discussion, but as long as we don't radically change from the intent and purpose of it, I think it's okay.
Right, and that's how it happens, Gene.
Yeah, Catholic Church 600 AD. And the next was when when Luther went and touched the thing on the door. He was there and he was not satisfied what was going on. That was 1500. That's 900 years before Martin Luther came out and started Lutheran Church. And then from there, since 1500, this developed now. And I can tell you, anybody that's, in the last 60 years, I've seen what Warren's talking about. Now that's just 60 years. So, but here's 900 years that Martin Luther came out of the Catholic Church.
And I think that's the reason Paul's addressing this here now to them is that you can't always believe what you hear from somebody else. And they didn't have the word like Trey said, we can come back and compare it to, but they did have the teachings that Paul gave them, right? So in whatever manner they wrote those down, as they, as you would think that they're writing, as you're being taught, you're making some kind of notes there, and they've got the letters that would be written to them, but it's just the word and preaching the word and continuing to do that. It's all, it's all verbal or whatever you're writing down, that you're, taking notes for what was taught to you.
Wouldn't there be people who are still following the gospel who made Paul aware of this to let him know that things were changing?
Oh, definitely, right. I mean, he knew about this.
Still, it's like, well, maybe they were like, what do we do?
Right. And that goes to show you, though, if they're writing to Paul saying, what do we do about this? Then they've got some leadership there that maybe is either unaware of what's going on or they're not handling the situation that we read about here. Not there yet. And I think the other point I wanted to make from this is that Paul was other people were glorifying God because of Paul's conversion. Paul, knowing that Paul was converted from Judaism and the teaching that he was doing before, and that because Paul is now a staunch believer and preaching the gospel, then other people are saying that Paul's glorifying God because the way he changed his life. And then that's the same way with us, is that we should be, somebody should see a change in us, right? We become a Christian, I don't do the things I used to do. The people at work should notice something different about me, that they didn't notice before. Or there should be something tangible that they should see. Oh, I didn't know you're a Christian. Well, I mean, it's possible people at work don't know that you're a Christian. I mean, if you don't go around with the Bible in your hand all the time, they might notice that. But if somebody was to say, oh, that person is a Christian, they shouldn't be surprised that you are, because of the actions that you display at work. All right, so they shouldn't be, oh, I didn't know that person is because they do this or this. Something. So the actions and the influence that we could have at work should be something that people could see outwardly. Oh, I see that he prays. Maybe you have a Bible on your desk. Maybe when you're out with other people eating a business meal, you say, "Hey, can we have a prayer?" You don't have to be overtly, carry a sign. I'm a Christian. Don't cuss around me, right? But if somebody does, you can say, "Hey, I appreciate it if you didn't say that." Good example: when Matt and Amy first moved here, we were all at, or some of us were at Acapulco, and people behind us, my hearing's not that good, but people behind us, I guess, were cussing, and we had kids with us at the table. And Matt turned around to some of the guys behind him and said, "Hey, we've got kids at this table, could you watch your language?" He didn't jump up and say, "I'm a Christian." To him, or to them, they wouldn't even necessarily know he is a Christian. It's just that, hey, I don't want you to use that kind of language. And so, it's just an opportunity that we have, as a Christian. We shouldn't, oh, I'm a Christian, I'm not going to say anything to those people because they might, say something to me.
Well, when I was at the AT&T, they were all, because the lottery was a big deal, because it was big, and they were all in our team was putting together money, but they looked at me, "No, you don't win, this big," and like that.
And they know not to ask, and that's a good thing, that they know what you stand for and what you believe in, and they don't ask you to do those things.
When I was volunteering with CASA, I mean, you can imagine, what I ran into with these teenagers and these guys, and they started all that slang word or whatnot, and I asked him, I said, what does that mean? Well, Jim, you know what that means. You know what that means. I said, I don't know what that means. But every once in a while, Betty would go with me out to take them out or wherever, And it was good because they could see, they'd open the door for Betty, and they could see maybe how we got along or whatnot. And we were on a trip in Indianapolis, and when I was sitting in the back, and he started this running, and I pulled over the side, and I said, "Now listen, I told you, I'm not going to put up with that." So he said, "Okay." So, I could have just said, "Well, he's a kid," but.
And I think that's the point, is that they knew, Paul used to do this, and they had only heard. A lot of people had never met Paul. But hearing that Paul was preaching the gospel when he used to do, this other thing, he used to kill Christians, and now he is a Christian, right? And so just the 180 that he had done, I think, was a good point that, all these Christians could glorify God, and that, look what Paul's done, Paul, and we can do the same thing. So I think that's just a good note. So I think our time's about up. Any other questions we have before we dismiss? So next week, Chuck should be back, and we'll start somewhere, in the end of chapter 1. Thanks a lot.